Okay, thank you very much for the introductions. So yeah, I'm Mark Chapman, I'm from the University of Southampton. I've never talked with a microphone like this, so I might electrocute myself when I take a drink. And there is a nice cable for me to trip over as well. So just get ready if you want to put me onto like you've been framed or something like that. So introductory slide. So I'm going to talk about, I work on domestication. So moving from wild species 10 or 12,000 years ago to the things we eat today. So drastic changes between these wild plants and these domesticated plants. And I'm going to talk a bit about why do we eat what we eat? Because actually we eat a very small amount of the edible plants that are available to us across the world. So I'm going to talk about what domestication is, just to put everyone in the sort of same situation, so we all know what I'm on about, hopefully. I'm going to talk about why we eat what we eat and why it's so little. And I don't mean so little in terms of calories. I mean in terms of the diversity that is available to us. Why have we ended up with just a small number of staple crops? And then I'm going to talk about why this could be a problem, and particularly with climate change, why that might be an issue. And then I'm going to move on to this group of species that we're calling underutilized crops. So they're fairly minor crops. You may have heard of some of them. You may not have heard of all of them. And when I say underutilized, they're species that we know have got a lot of potential, but they haven't received very much type of research sort of internationally. So locally, they'd be very, very important to people all over the world, but internationally, there's much less known about them. So what's domestication? Well, first of all, it's mutualistic. So actually, there's a human and there's a plant. It could be a human and a cow or a human and whatever, but let's say a human and a plant. Mutualistic means that both partners get a benefit from it. So we get food or something else, and the plant gets a place to live, it gets watered, it gets fertilized, there's weeding that goes on. That plant's a pretty lucky plant at the end of the day. One organism assumes significant degree of influence over the other. So we plant them when we want to plant them. We harvest them when we want to harvest them. We do other things to them if we want to. So we're kind of taking charge of what that plant is going to do. And the whole purpose is to get some predictable or greater amount of something from that plant, a resource that we want to get hold of. But that other partner gets an advantage as well. And like I said, if you feed it, if you water it, it's going to be a bigger plant. It's going to be a happy plant. So it's mutualistic. Both partners get a benefit. Just to say, it's not all about food. So we have a lot of species that have been domesticated for things like fibers. Cotton is a classic example. There's a lot of plant-based dyes that we get from plants. And there's also, in terms of animals, we have to think about muscle and companionship. So cows and things to pull our carts, and something like a dog or a cat, which we like to have lying at the end of our bed, just to sort of feel nice and have around us. And it's not just about, even if we think about food crops, it's not just about the bit we eat. So during domestication, we tend to get more of the thing we eat, but we also get changes in associated morphologies and traits. So it might be more rapid germination or predictable germination. We all know that some plants won't germinate every year, they can be dormant, whereas humans have sort of bred those traits out, and we know when we plant our peas in January or February, we know that they're probably going to germinate. We're not worried about some germinating in 1 or 2 years' time. Harvestability. So actually, a lot of the plants that we rely on now are much easier to harvest than their wild relatives would be. And there's things like storage qualities. So over time, humans have selected for the plants that store better. So if there's a bunch of different types of beans, and some of them rot within a couple of weeks, and some of them are perfectly fine to be dried out and provide sustenance over a few months, they're the ones that we're going to have started to spend more time domesticating. So thinking of harvestability, so there's this is rice. We've got 2 types of rice here, and basically if you shake a rice plant, the seeds aren't going to fall off. But the one on the right here, you can see that it's being shook and all the seeds are falling off. Now, most wild species want to release their seeds because they want the seeds to fall on the floor. They want them to germinate and form the next generation. But humans don't want to be on their knees picking up seeds all the time. They want the plant on the left where they can just pull the head off, put it in a bag. So over time, There's been these slight mutational changes that change something that loses its seeds to something that keeps its seeds. Now, this doesn't make it more tasty. It doesn't necessarily mean there's more yield, but the human gets the benefit because it was much easier to harvest. And if it's more efficient, that's better for the human. Another example as well is about spines and things that might keep herbivores at bay. So this picture in the middle is a wild aubergine. It's found throughout Southeast Asia, but there's other close relatives that live around the Mediterranean. And if you zoom in on the leaves, you'll see these big 1 to 2 centimeter long spines. Now in the wild, this is brilliant because the plant doesn't want to be eaten by a cow or whatever comes along. But humans, they're going to spend all their time getting scratched hands. Let me know if I'm doing something wrong. No? Okay. The human doesn't want all those scratches. So if there's a slight mutation that means that that thorny part is softer or smaller, humans are going to select those plants instead of the really spiny ones that scratch the back of their hands. So we have this set of traits, this set of differences that tend to differentiate most wild plants from most domesticated plants. Now, it's not universal, but in general, we have a loss of shattering. So that means that the plants don't drop all their seeds. We've got increased in the bit that we eat. So if we eat the seeds, we tend to get larger seeds in our domesticated plants. If we eat the leaves, if we eat the fruits, they tend to be larger in the domesticated type relative to the wilds. We've got a loss of dormancy. And again, like I said before, this allows us to have predictable germination. And we've got something called apical dominance. So if you look at the sunflower on the right, this is what we call apically dominant because it has one big flower head, whereas the one on the left, it's got lots and lots of small flower heads. So in general, our domesticated plants have kind of gone through this transition, losing some traits, gaining some traits, changing some traits. So there's a lot of changes that do go on. And in actual fact, domestication is a very recent phenomenon compared to normal kind of typical evolution. So this is a wild brassica on the left. You've probably seen it along the roadsides in the UK. And over the last few thousand years, this has been changed drastically by humans picking certain plants with certain different traits of interest. So wild Brassica oleracea has been domesticated into kohlrabi, kale, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, and cauliflower. Drastically different plants, which all come from one wild species, and in a few thousand years. Now, to put that into context, most species were domesticated a maximum of 12,000 years ago. Some much more recent, in a few thousand years ago. So we think brassicas were domesticated about 6,000 years ago. Humans and chimps diverged 6 million years ago. So 1,000 times more recent than the divergence between us and a chimp. And largely, I would say that us and a chimp look more similar than a Brussels sprout and a cauliflower at the end of the day. Some people more so than others, but we won't. I'm not pointing. I usually do point to someone when I give a lecture, actually. But arguably, we've got much more drastic changes than sort of typical evolutionary changes. And this is, I was just saying this to the team here, that this is one of the reasons I really like working on domestication, because we've got very recent, very drastic changes. But I'm an evolutionary biologist. That's what I'm really interested in. There's other examples as well. So this is wheat. On the left, we've got a wild wheat. On the right, we've got bread wheat. So this is obviously the one that we get our hovis and everything from. And in the middle, we've got two other types of wheat. You might have heard of Emma wheat and things, but they're not so widely grown. But you can see that the amount of food you get per ear of wheat is probably an order of magnitude larger in the domesticated bread wheat than it is in the wild wheat. So again, we just need tiny mutations to slightly change those things. And humans are pretty smart. They will pick the one that's easiest to harvest, gives you the more nutrients, gives you more bang for your buck, essentially. So if we get any mutations that change our seed size, change our fruit size, humans are pretty smart, and they'll take 10 of the big ones instead of 100 of the small ones, so to speak. Now I've got a quiz. It's not really a quiz, it's one question. Does anyone recognize this? And can anyone guess what this is the wild relative of? Oh, there's always someone who says asparagus, and I never even thought that, but even in my lectures, someone always says asparagus. It's not asparagus, sorry. No, not lemongrass. No, not celery. Really, really important crop. Looks not much like this, actually. That's why I do it as a trick. Sweet corn. And this is to scale. So the one on the left, with this tiny little, it's got about 10 little very hard capsules that 10,000 years ago in Mexico, someone would have had to have smashed with a rock to get anything out of, and then they can boil it and make a porridge or something. The one on the right, obviously this is our supermarket sweet corn, the one we expect. Up until anyone had done any genetics in about the 1970s, no one knew that these were related to each other. And you can understand why. If you're looking at both of those, you would never think, well, this one's clearly just a relative of this. So until we could do any genetics, no one knew what the wild progenitor of corn actually looked like. So drastic changes, some more than others, but drastic changes over just a few thousand years. So the next part of my talk is about why do we eat what we eat? And I'm typically focusing on crops. So 90% of all the plants we eat come from just 15 crops. This is globally, so individually, there's obviously differences. 42% of our calories globally come from 3 plants. They come from rice, which is about 19%, so nearly 1 in 5 of our calories in the whole world comes from rice. Wheat, about 18%, so again, nearly one in 5 of our calories. And then maize and other products that come from maize is about another 5%. So nearly half of our calories, let's say close to 1,500 a day, nearly half of those come from just 3 plants: wheat, rice, and maize. So this is great if you really like wheat, rice, and maize, and it's great if you are one of these because you're super, super popular. But there's still some sort of issues with that. Now, one of the issues is that when we rely on a very small amount of plants, if there's a pest or a pathogen that comes in and it overcomes whatever resistance that plant has, it could decimate. And this is the classic example we always talk about is the Irish potato famine. So the 1845 to 52, there was a fungus called Phytophthora. It came in and it basically decimated all of the potatoes in Ireland. And the population of Ireland was a little bit less than 4 million at the time. 1 million of those 4 million died, and 1 million of those 4 million emigrated. So drastic changes based on one pathogen and based on the fact that there was pretty much sole reliance on one type of potato across the whole country. This isn't the only example. There's other examples. You might have heard recently about a pest that's attacking bananas, and there's a genuine threat that we've got so little diversity in our bananas. We basically rely on one cultivar or 1 or 2. So 1 or 2 types of bananas, and they're susceptible to this pest. There's other examples, so I'm just going to go through 2. So first of all, it does increase our susceptibility to climate change, and it possibly also limits the amount of nutrients and the quality and quantity of nutrients we're taking in. So this is just a graph from a scientific paper, but you can see from the headline, it's a bit, they're clearly trying to do a bit of a Daily Mail or a Daily Mirror here, but temperature increases, reduces global yields of major crops. That's pretty drastic if you think about it. So first of all, in this graph, this is the estimated temperature increase over the next few decades. And the 4 different colors just mean basically on the left, we've got drastic changes to the amount of carbon we're releasing and the types of things we're doing day to day. And on the right, we've got business as usual. So somewhere between, the temperature will increase between about 1 and about 3.5 degrees over the next few decades. Now, a few degrees, probably most people, I know that you're all very smart people, so that's good. But some people say, I don't mind if it's a bit more like Tenerife in the summer. I'd be okay with that. Now, if you think about our food, then we're slightly risking ourselves. So this graph, don't worry about all the details. We've got 4 different crops, wheat, rice, maize, and soybean. So the 3 I've already talked about that make up 42% of our diet, and soybeans, which are a massive food for cows across the world. Massive amounts of soybean are produced to feed cows. All of these, you'll see the bar is pointing downwards. So This is our estimated change in yield per degree C increase in temperature. So wheat, we estimate that there'll be a 6% decrease in yield if temperature goes up 1 degree. For rice, it's about 3, maize 8, soybean another 3. So a few percent decrease for every degree. If our temperature does increase by 3 degrees, we could be losing 18 to 20% of our wheat yield, probably almost 25% of our maize, and so on and so on. So potentially, if we don't have much diversity in our diets, we are risking that there'll be a particularly bad year, and we all remember the temperatures hitting 40 degrees relatively recently. A couple of years like that, we could significantly affect the food that is available to us. The other thing I mentioned is nutrition. So I've got here about 12 different types of beans. In general, on the left are probably things you've heard of. In general, on the right are probably things you haven't heard of. And I'm going to come back to the ones on the right later. But you'll see edamame, so if you've ever had those in a Japanese restaurant, they're basically young soybeans. Lentils, pinto beans, black beans, kidney beans, and lima beans. It's the type of things you might buy. You might make a chili con carne, whatever. You get them in tins very easily in the supermarkets. You can see Waitrose from here. They've got about 8% protein, something like that. There's a bunch of other legumes, these ones on the right, they've got between 20 and 35% protein. So if we could start substituting some of our diet, and we don't have to make huge changes, but if we substituted some of our diet with some of these slightly unusual beans, and some of them are quite hard to get hold of, but not all of them, but we could be doubling our protein intake without really changing the types of meals that we can create. I will go back to this one. And another risk is that nutrition can actually change based on the environment. And there's quite an interesting paper. Again, we're going for drastic headlines here. Increasing CO2 threatens human nutrition. What transpires is basically for wheat, rice, peas, and soybean, the amount of iron, zinc, and protein decreases when carbon dioxide increases. And we all know carbon dioxide is part of something that's all increasing on our atmosphere now to levels that we haven't experienced for thousands, well, probably hundreds of thousands of years. So pretty much all of the crops, at least the ones on the left-hand side of this graph, are all going to be negatively affected. Now, maize and sorghum, they're interesting. They carry out their photosynthesis. They get their energy from the light, but they do that in a slightly different way. And it seems like they're not going to be as negatively affected. But across the board, it does look like climate change is not only going to decrease yield, but what yield we do get may be lower in really important things like iron, zinc, and protein. So again, going back to this, so what do we eat and why do we only eat this very small number? And that's something I've been thinking about, and something that we've started researching now is there's thousands and thousands of edible species. Pretty much, you could go out and eat dandelion leaves if you want to, but a dandelion has never been domesticated. What is it about that? We've probably got, so even though we've got 3 kind of big hitters, there's probably a couple of hundred species we could call domesticated. And that varies from our wheats and rice and maizes down to other sort of more minor crops that I'm going to talk about. And there's good archaeological evidence that lots of plants were collected and even cultivated around 10,000 years ago. But since then, a large proportion of those just got abandoned, and we just started eating a very small number of crops. So what was it about that small number of crops relative to the large number that were being collected and being cultivated? And that's kind of what I'm interested in my lab, is why we had this big sort of bottleneck. Hundreds and hundreds of plants probably being eaten, lots of them being cultivated, most of them then just disbanded, and only a few focused on. I'm going to go through a couple of ideas that we've got in my lab now. So first of all, is every species domesticatable? So can we take any wild species and select on the bits we want, and can it change into something domesticated? Possibly not. Possibly it's not that easy. So the way I think about this is what happens during domestication. So we have a population of wild plants, and there's some sort of mutation turns up that makes the seed not dormant, or it makes the fruit 5% bigger. So we could have these mutational changes. So maybe there's a set of plants where mutation is a lot faster. These things happen and humans see them and select them. So it could be that the species that were domesticated just mutate faster. Another thing we're looking at is something called plasticity. So when you take a bunch of plants and you grow them in different environments, even if they're genetically identical, they might change the way they grow. They might flower earlier or later, they might be taller, they might be more bushy. This is something called plasticity. So genetically identical things looking different. I'll explain why that's important. So just two examples. So these are wild species. These haven't been domesticated, but these are nice examples of plasticity. So there's a roripara at the top, that's related to things like brassicas, but quite distantly related, and a polygonum at the bottom. The pair of plants are genetically identical, but they've been grown in different environments. So you get fairly drastic differences in the morphology. Now, at the time when plants were being domesticated, two main things were happening. So first of all, humans were collecting the plants and growing them around where they lived. They were possibly adding manure. There's good archaeological evidence for that. They were probably doing weeding. They were probably doing watering. So we changed their environment. And another thing about 10,000 years ago is that the climate was changing. It was getting warmer and the CO2 was increasing. So there's these two main changes that were going on. Humans were growing wild plants around where they lived, feeding them, watering them, so on and so on. And the climate was changing. So if there is a set of plants that respond favorably to that, so they might get bigger, they might get larger fruits, they might have more resistance to some sort of pest, just based on making these changes or this climate change, maybe they were the ones that humans started to domesticate. Because if there were 3 beans that you were growing in your patch outside your tent, and 2 of them stayed the same and 1 of them got bigger, it wouldn't be, it's not not a very big jump to say, well, humans would pick that one and not those 2. So that's what we're trying to investigate in my lab. And we've got a project going on. I've got a PhD student called Anne. So that's where these pictures come from. Here we've got a wild tomato. This is a species that's found in Peru. It's got one of the best names, Solanum pimpinellifolium. One of my favorites. I quite often slip up, so I'm glad I said that right. But these are genetically identical, so they all came from the same mother tomato. But you'll see that we've got a tall plant on the left, so that's grown in a big pot with highly nutritious soil. So imagining like if we added manure, if we added whatever, that might look like that. The one in the middle, big pot, so there's plenty of room to grow, but it's really poor soil. It's gritty, it's sandy. And the one on the right, we've got a tiny little pot. So the plant has got root bound and it's much smaller. So in her experiments, she's comparing the progenitor species and how they respond to other wild species, other wild tomatoes. And in this picture here, you've got domesticated tomatoes on the left, and then the ones at the bottom are Solanum pimpinellifolium, the little red ones, and there's a yellowy one and a green one as well. So she's got 2 other species, and she's looking at how they respond to changes in the environment. The hypothesis being the crop progenitor, so the one that was domesticated, gets bigger, gets more fruit, something like that, when you change the environment, whereas the other wild species don't do that. So she's getting towards the end of her PhD. We're writing this up. We've made some nice progress with that. But it's not just tomatoes where this happens. So I talked about the differences between a wild and a domesticated corn. And here we've got a wild corn on the left. This is obviously the whole plant, not the ear. You can see it's bushy. It's much wider. It's much more vegetative. The one on the right, it's much more, it's got one stem. So this is that thing called apical dominance. So you lose all the branching and you get just 1 or 2 big ears of corn on the plant. This is what they look like when you grow them in just a regular environment. This is someone I know quite well. This is Dolores Paperno. And this is a wild maize, but it's growing in a really poor environment. And you'll see it's got a thin one stem. It's got smaller ears. It hasn't got a big bushiness. So even though it is the species on the left, we know that, it looks much more like the species on the right. So we change the environment, we change what it looks like. If some species respond more than others, these might be the ones that we've collected and then we've started cultivating and then we've started selecting and domesticating. And other ones are just disbanded. So that's something we're digging into. Now, something I talked about was these underutilized crops. So crops with a lot of potential, but it's generally not well known internationally. They're generally not well researched. And there's certainly not a lot of investment compared to things like our big three crops we've talked about. So this is something I've talked about. So our staple crops, they lack diversity in terms of the number of species we eat, but also each of those probably lacks diversity. So across the UK, there will be a small number of wheat varieties that are grown on thousands and thousands of acres. And it would be the same, you know, if you go to the supermarket and you want tomatoes, there's not the massive variety that you could be growing in your garden. And I know I like to do that. I'm much more interested in something that's a sort of funny shape or a slightly odd colour rather than everything being uniform. But if you go to the supermarket, you are very limited in your choices. And we know that there's potential risks from climate change. Right, quick just risk of electrocution. We're all good, I'm still here. So, as I said, there are probably 200 to 300 species we could call domesticated. Now, even if I asked everyone in this room to come up with this list, as many domesticated species as you could, probably we would get to 50, maybe 60. And then we'd be dredging the barrel with things like coriander and lemongrass and lychee and things like that. But there's dozens and dozens more that are very much less well known. So typically they're locally important. So in parts of the world they're grown, they're really important, but across the world they're not traded, they're not spread around. So some of these crops, when they grow them, they're called insurance crops. So if you imagine a farmer in Africa and he's got his patch of land and he's growing maize, and he knows that if it's a very hot year, he's not going to get any maize. He's going to do his best, but if it's too hot, it's just not going to grow very well. So maybe only 1 in 5 years that will happen, maybe 1 in 10 years, but there's always a risk. So on a patch of his land, he will grow a separate crop. And he knows that that's not going to yield nearly as much as his maize, but if his maize fails, this one is going to yield something. And his family might not be a big fan of this slightly unusual bean, that it might be a bit bitter or it might not be as yummy as corn on the cob, but it's food, it's sustenance and it's protein. So they call them insurance crops because they grow them just in case it's a bad year. Now, typically, one of the reasons we can call these underutilized is that they don't yield very well. So you can't get as high a yield from some of these crops, well, from all of these crops than you can compared to staple crops. So at the moment, there hasn't been the investment that we're anywhere close. Yields would be a fraction of wheat or rice or something. Some of them contain things like anti-nutrient factors. So when you're eating plants that are full of iron and full of zinc, if you're also eating something that's got a lot of phytate in it, your body doesn't take up the iron and zinc. So you have to have, if you're eating things to get lots of iron and zinc, you don't want plants that have also got anti-nutrient factors. That slows down the uptake, so you just don't get the benefit. Now, one of the advantages is they may bring something novel. We can have novel traits, and we can have diverse traits as well. So I'm going to talk about a few examples. So in terms of, there's a couple of fruits here. So if you've ever had jackfruit, you may have had jackfruit. You can buy it in a tin from most Asian supermarkets. It's super high in vitamins A, C, and B6. Baobab, unlikely you've had that, but it's a plant it's a tree that can grow for like over 1,000 years. But its fruit, if you've got 40 grams of that fruit, quite a small portion, 40 grams, a couple of tablespoons, that's 100% of your recommended daily allowance of vitamin C. So there's a lot of fantastic things out there. However, if you need to grow a baobab, you probably wait 100 years before you get any fruit at all. And it lives in very hot places, and it's probably only a small amount of fruit per tree. So there's disadvantages too. Vegetables, so there's something called a sacred lotus. It's actually a really beautiful sort of water lily type plant, and it produces a really big root. We call it a corm, and it's full of protein, packed with protein, and potentially medicinally as well, potentially good for you. And I've got a student working in my lab at the moment on this species of hibiscus. It's also known as roselle. And the plant's got very strong fibers in it, and also you can make a tea from the dried up petals. So lots of interesting plants, but when you think about how well they yield compared to wheat, rice, and everything else, they're just not gonna get there. The other thing about this picture is, see these books here, these are all from about the 1970s. We've got, there's a whole book on something called a winged bean, which actually I did a piece of work on. There's a book called The Lost Crops of Africa, and one called Underexploited Tropical Plants with Promising Economic Value. Now, in the 1970s, people were talking about these crops, but not actually much has really happened until certainly the last 5 or 10 years. And this is just a picture of some of those. So I was in Hong Kong last year. That's a jackfruit. So it's giant fruit, about the size of a small hippo, I like to call it. But it's probably about 2 foot something long. It probably weighs about 15 to 20 kilos, but it's full of lots and lots of pulp. This is a baobab fruit. So this is the one where it's really high in vitamin C, but unlikely you just get that in your regular supermarket. Sacred lotus. Occasionally when you have Chinese food, you might get these things that look a bit like a wagon wheel, just these very thin slices. That's lotus fruit. And this is roselle. So this is just the dried up buds, basically, that you can make tea from. Now, I showed you this graph already. So we've got staple beans on the left and these underutilized beans on the right. And you'll see here there's adzuki beans. You can get, actually, I noticed this the other day. If you buy a 5-bean salad from, I think it's Sainsbury's 5-bean salad in a tin, one of those beans is adzuki beans. So you might be getting a little bonus bit of protein if you have that instead of just regular beans on toast. But we've got lots of other types of beans, and we've done a bit of work on some of these, and we're very interested in their sort of genetics and things like that. But there's one I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail. And this one's called the lablab bean. So lablab, it's a legume. It's very, very drought tolerant. So it's one of these crops grown in Africa that is an insurance crop, because at the end of the day, it's very likely to make it through a hot summer compared to maybe something like maize or wheat, which is a bit more risky. So first of all, this isn't my data, but this is a graph basically showing how long it takes for a plant to die when you stop watering it. So fairly simple science at the end of the day. But we've got lablab on the left, we've got various other things across the bottom, and I've just highlighted maize and then soybean as well. And you'll see lablab wins, it's the furthest on the left, and in this experiment it took 30 days of no watering before there was any sign of that plant dying. Soybean on the right, it's less than 10 days. So we've got very strong drought tolerance in these lablab beans. And then this is just what it looks like. These are the pods. They can be eaten like a kind of mange tout, like when the pods are quite young, or you can leave them until the beans develop, and then the beans can be dried and stored and then used later. This is some experiment from my lab. So I've got another PhD student, a different PhD student, and she's been looking at the nutrition and how these plants respond to drought. And, I seem to have 2 slides showing up, which is a little bit weird. I've never had that before. Now, if I close this, what's going to happen? Yep, I knew it. Right, I'm going to fast forward. You've all seen this, you all know it. You'll pass the test later, right? You have been. All right, how far have we got to go? A couple more. Right, excellent. So she's been looking at how the plants respond to drought. And one of the things we've noticed is when you measure that, so this is iron on the left and zinc on the right. The wild lablab, the ones that haven't been domesticated, have a high iron and zinc, higher than the domesticated one. So actually, even though we talk about lablab being underutilized, there's plenty of opportunities here to actually breed and potentially get even higher zinc and iron in it. And also you can see that the domesticated ones, so the 2 bars on the right, they don't seem to change the amount of iron or zinc depending on the drought. But on the left, when you drought the plants, you drought the wild plants, you get a significant reduction in the amount of iron and zinc. So there's lots of things we need to be aware of when we're thinking about these crops. And this is just lablab, but it's the same probably for most crops that are underutilized. And something I do, so I'm really interested in, I've always been interested in genetics, and more recently, the whole genome sequencing, because it's getting much cheaper. The Human Genome Project must have cost billions of dollars. Now we can sequence a genome fairly well. You can sequence it fairly badly for a couple of £100. You can sequence it very well for a couple of £1,000. And actually, when you think about the resource that you're building, a couple of £1,000 is a very significant and important and fairly light investment. So we've been doing that with lablab. So one of the things that I was interested in is there's these 2 main morphological groups. There's wild and domesticated lab that have 2 seeds in a pod, and there's wild and domesticated lab that have 4 seeds in a pod. So how are these things related to each other? So what we did is we did genome sequencing, and we've basically sequenced the genome of lots and lots of wild and domesticated lab. And then you put them into this. It's called a phylogenetic tree, but it's basically just looking at how things are related to each other. So the light green, that's our wild, and our dark green, that's our domesticated. So at the top, if you look at just the green part, you've got a wild and a domesticated closely related to each other. And if you look at the bottom, you've got another wild and domesticated closely related. So we've got domesticated ones that come from different populations of wild plants. So instead of just having one population of wild lab and now a domesticated population, we've got a fairly widespread wild population, a domestication in North Africa and a domestication in South Africa. So it's a really nice evolutionary model. So again, this is going back to what I'm interested in. But you can see here also, all of these other plants on here, these are other types of beans. Phaseolus vulgaris, that's your normal sort of dwarf beans and your climbing beans. There's, what else is in there? Cowpea is in there, and the adzuki bean as well. So lab, it comes out quite different to all these other beans. There's quite a long evolutionary gap there. And this is just what the pods look like. So these actually come from herbarium samples, so samples that have been collected in the wild and dried and stored at Kew. And we've been looking at trying to get DNA from these as well. So you can get DNA from very, very old plant specimens. So on the left, we have the 2 seeds per pod, and these are much more sort of square or rhomboid sort of shaped pods. The one on the right, this is the 4 seeds, and they're much longer, four seeds in a row, basically. So we've got nice evidence here, and we published this work last year. We've got nice evidence here that it was domesticated in 2 different places. Now, these are some of the other species I worked on. I seem to have started working on a lot of things because of their weird names, but that's fine. So lab, I actually wanted to call myself the lab. Unfortunately, someone on Twitter had already got there, so I almost ditched lab and picked something else, but no, I stuck with it. But there's a species called Kirsting's groundnut. Now, groundnut is another name for a peanut. So this is a species that grows like a peanut. It produces flowers. The flowers go underground, they pollinate themselves, and they produce the pods underground. That's what a peanut does, and so does this species called Kirsting's groundnut. But they're actually not very closely related to each other. And there's something called a zombie pea. So I've been working with a group. There's a group in South Africa and a group in Thailand, and they grow zombie peas there. So we're doing work on their genetics and trying to work out where they were domesticated. Is there any level of drought tolerance and things like that? There are 3 legumes I work on. There's also rami, which is a fiber crop, and it's related to nettles, actually. So it has a lot of fiber in it. And buckwheat. So you can actually buy buckwheat in Sainsbury's now. It's very, very nutritious, and we call it a pseudo-cereal. So it looks like lots of tiny grains, but it's not a grass crop like rice and wheat and things like that. It's from a different family. But it is another nutritious grain, and there's lots of things to be researching on these. So just wrapping up, so what else do we need to be doing? So just to think about like where this type of science is going in the future. So as I said, it's not particularly difficult, particularly expensive now to sequence a genome. A little bit of investment from a grant funder, and you can do this, and you can get a lot of information. One of the issues is sequencing one genome doesn't tell you a lot. If you sequence lots of genomes from drought tolerant and drought sensitive types, from high nutrient and low nutrient types, then you can start comparing the genes and trying to work out which genes control these important traits. And we also need to talk to farmers, and we need to talk to breeders. So farmers, we need to know which one grows best and why. Why would you plant this one this year? Why would you plant this one next year? And also the breeders, what are people interested in? There's not really much use for a bunch of scientists in the UK to say we're going to focus on this one when a farmer in Africa says we don't like the white ones. We only like the brown ones. Sorry, we probably should have asked you. So there is a lot of this kind of research going on in the West, and I say the West as in sort of North America and here, as well as China, and it's not including local people who are actually growing, actually eating these beans. So that's one of the issues we have come up with recently, is that there needs to be more training for people in country who are growing these beans, who know what they're looking for, know what the farmers like, and know what the consumers like. And so we're trying to get through to this decolonialism. So there's this sort of mantra of sort of the West is best. So we'll turn up and we'll say, you don't want to grow this bean, you want to grow that bean. And then they'll say at the end of the day, well, we don't like those ones, we like these ones. And until we talk to them, we don't actually know these things. So a lot of my research, and a lot of groups are doing this, so I'm not trying to show off or anything, but a lot of groups are trying to actually focus on people in country, talk to them, discuss with them, why do you only grow the white ones in this field and only grow the brown ones in this field? Things like that. Things that we wouldn't have a clue. We need to talk to those people. Right, just to wrap up, well, that is me wrapped up. So I guess I will open the floor to questions. Is that how we do it now? All good? All good?